Okay, so yeah.
I can take yours. Well, a very warm welcome to you all. Thanks for coming to the Einstein Forum. My name is Martin Schad. I'm the Vice Director of the institution, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Susan Nyman. And I'm very happy to be able to welcome Elisabeth. Thanks for being here. I will make no further introductions because this is part of the work why we have Werner Schiffauer here. He is Professor Emeritus of Comparative Cultural and Social Anthropology at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder. And for many years, as a researcher, as well as a much sought-after expert, he has studied Islamic and Islamist communities in Germany, tracing above all the constitution of minority identities. I could name a multitude of publications and activities to prove that Werner Schiffauer is quite simply the best qualified interlocutor for this evening. Instead, I would like to highlight past pro toto just one project that Werner Schiffauer co-directed under the title Global Prayers, Redemption and Liberation in the City. Scholars, together with artists, investigated the question of what effect religious movements have on the culture, the economy, and on the everyday life in metropolitan regions. A question that equally concerns Elisabeth Becker, as she has impressively demonstrated in her recently published book, Mosques in the Metropolis. And with that note, I'd like to give the floor to you, Werner Schiffauer, to introduce Elisabeth.
Thank you so much, Martin. And thank you for the invitation and for chairing this session with Elisabeth, which is a great honor to me. Because Elisabeth and I met for the first time in June or something, and I was impressed about the plans she had and about the project she told me about, the project she will share with us this evening. Now, Elisabeth can be best described by the name of the scholarship she has now. It is the Freigeist scholarship. She is a Freigeist Fellow at the Max Weber Institute for Sociology at Heidelberg University. And Freigeist, of course, means that kind of spirit and captures very well the spirit which drives Elisabeth in her academic work. It is a spirit of fearlessness, even recklessness, with which she challenges established notions which are strongly held and often fiercely defended. Notions about the Judeo-Christian heritage of Europe, notions about Muslims, and notions about the comparability of the Jewish experience in Europe and the Muslim experience in Europe. And she will share these ideas with us this evening. She herself had received her training at Cornell University, later Oxford and Yale, and is now based in Heidelberg and working on a new project that is Invisible Architects, Jews, Muslims, and the Making of Europe. And of course, it's quite an original meaning you attach to the word architect, and maybe we can link to the new project in the discussion. But now I want to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me speak here tonight, and for everyone who is listening, whether in person or online. So today I am going to draw from my book that you see here, Mosques in the Metropolis, Incivility, Caste, and Contention in Europe. This book, it centers on the experience of two mosque communities, one very close to here in Berlin, the Schädlich Mosque, which is in Neukölln in Berlin, and the East London Mosque in London. And tonight I will focus more on the Schädlich Mosque, not only because we're in Germany and close to Berlin, but because of some of the kind of echoes that I want to speak about with the Jewish experience and with Jewish scholars and thinkers who have thought through some of the challenges that we face, I think, in Europe today, in Germany in particular, but not only in Germany, in thinking about what a plural Europe, what a plural Germany, what a plural capital city look like. So the title of my talk, as you see here, is Strangers from Another Time, Muslims, Jews, Europe's, well, it was Unsettling Echoes, then I changed it to Europe's Unsettling Echoes. That's just a photo of the book. I will start today with a quote that will come up, sort of echo throughout the presentation itself. And this is a quote from Walter Benjamin, who is one of the thinkers that I worked with during my research and in sort of processing my research and thinking through the Muslim experience today in Europe. The quote is, "The phenomenon of déjà vu has often been described. Is the term really apt? Shouldn't we rather speak of events which affect us like an echo, one awakened by a sound that seems to have issued from somewhere in the darkness of a past life? Just as the latter points us to a stranger who is on the premises, so there are words or pauses pointing us to that invisible stranger, the future." This photograph is not from one of my research sites, but is rather in East Berlin, in Mitte, in a square called Kappenplatz. And quite recently, actually about 3 months ago, I was sitting in Kappenplatz. I lived close to there for the last year before we moved to Heidelberg. And I was looking at this memorial. This is a memorial to Jews who were murdered and expelled from their homes surrounding this place in particular in East Berlin. And this was, for some reason, one of the memorials that always drew me towards it. It's not one of the kind of larger, grander memorials, but it is one that's in a live space of the city. So right next to this, you can see the park behind it. This was taken at a time of day I never saw there. This is not my photograph, because usually there are people sitting, there are people in the grass, and behind it there's a school, so you can always hear children playing and laughing. And there is this juxtaposition of this memorial, this kind of presence of an absence that you feel when you sit and look at it. So as I was thinking about this a few months ago, someone actually came and sat down on the memorial or on the chair at this table. And there was something shocking in this to me. I almost wanted to tell them, like, you shouldn't be sitting there. This is a memorial. Look at there's a quotes around it. There's a poem by Nelly Sachs, a Jewish German writer who moved to Israel. But then I stopped myself and I also reflected on how so much of where we live, so much of Berlin, so much of Europe is spaces in which there have been loss of life. And these are still the spaces in which we live today. And that this kind of loss and absence and then our presence do interact with one another in many ways. So what I will suggest today in some ways follows in the line of scholars who have suggested that we should think about the Muslim experience and the experience specifically of marginalization, of exclusion, of inequality, of the incapacity to be seen as full cultural citizens of Europe, of Germany. We should think of this in terms of, or in relation to, the Jewish past. Now, what I will try to sort of convince you of is not the productivity of simply thinking about the echoes of this history, but thinking about how we can bring the scholarship, that is the thought of Jewish thinkers from the 20th century, into conversation with the challenges that we face today, specifically the challenges of including large-scale Muslim populaces. They're large in terms of Europe's own kind of makeup, right? If you look at European countries, Germany, France, the UK, they have 5 or 6% of the population as Muslim. So it's not actually huge numbers, but for these countries and their histories, these are kind of unprecedented numbers in terms of populations that are seen to be those with quote unquote migration backgrounds. At the heart of my book then are these kind of embodiments of what I term the Abrahamic stranger, which I'll discuss a little bit more. And that's how I relate Muslims and Jews quite a bit in terms of being both inside and outside of Europe, being seen as somehow part of Europe, but also apart from Europe, sometimes in juxtaposition to Europe, sometimes seen as a threat to Europe, sometimes seen as a sort of internal problem that Europe has to deal with. Always a way in which Europe looks at itself is through these populations. And this has continued throughout Europe's history. Now, the thing that I found the most innovative in the book was bringing these voices of Jewish thinkers who dealt with a lot of these issues themselves through their lives and through their writings, like Walter Benjamin and many others who I'll name. There are many, so when I give you the list, you don't need to remember them at all. But how these kind of help to shed light on some of the challenges we see today. There is this kind of sense of deja vu I would sometimes have, myself being a Jewish American who grew up with these stories and these intellectuals on my bookshelves and in my home. These echoes when I spoke to my Muslim interlocutors from the mosque, for instance, here at the Shade Lake Mosque, in describing their experiences and their concerns and the ways in which they felt they were somehow, again, partially included and excluded from society. So some of the thinkers that I will talk about today are Jewish in terms of their kind of religious identification or cultural identification. Some talk about their own Jewish ancestry, but wouldn't identify as Jewish. Some are identified by society as Jewish, like Georg Simmel, who was the sociologist who thought of this idea of the stranger in the first place, of being someone who is both inside and outside. And Simmel actually used this description to describe his own positionality, and this positionality of not being able to be fully included, but also being a constituent part of society, a part of society that society essentially couldn't get rid of, and then still see itself as whole. So it's this very kind of paradoxical position. And he explicitly did say that when I'm talking about the stranger, the kind of ultimate example of the stranger is the European Jew. So other thinkers that I worked with were Hermann Cohen, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, Zygmunt Bauman, Ernst Bloch, Hans Jonas, Herbert Gans, and Richard Sennett. So they kind of span from the end of the 19th century into today. Both Gans and Sennett are still around. But what was important to me wasn't whether they identified as kind of religious Jews or cultural Jews or whether these categories matter anyway, but that there was this perspective in which they were drawing from Jewish tradition, or they were themselves drawing from the experience of being Jewish in European society that influenced their work. That's all of their faces. And so this is how Georg Simmel essentially defined the stranger in his seminal essay on the stranger. A stranger is not a wanderer who may come today and leave tomorrow. He comes today and stays. He is a potential wanderer. Although he has not moved on from the society, he has not quite shed the freedom to stay or go either. He remains within a specific place, but he has not always belonged to it. And so he carries into it qualities that could not belong there. 80 years later, another sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, worked a lot with this idea of the stranger. And he was actually looking at through his own lens of experience, having fled the Nazis, he was looking at his own experience and he was trying to make sense of what went wrong in modernity. How could we have this kind of modern order and this post-enlightenment or enlightened era and still have the Holocaust occur? And his argument was essentially that strangers threaten ideas of coherence in modernity, that, as he says in his words, the stranger's unredeemable sin is the incompatibility between his presence and other presences fundamental to the world order. His simultaneous assault on several crucial oppositions, instrumental in the incessant effort of ordering. It's this sin which throughout modern history rebounds in the constitution of the stranger as the bearer and embodiment of incongruity. The stranger is, for this reason, the bane of modernity. So again, he's reflecting on his own position in this very specific time. And he again invokes the Jew as the prototypical ethnic, religious, cultural stranger. So the words that he uses, so this kind of collapsing of all of these different identifications or ways of categorizing people, whether into ethnic, religious, or cultural groups. Now, my argument builds on this kind of legacy in sociology, and I argue that it's really through a discourse of incivility that the full belonging of Muslims, like Jews prior, has not been accomplished. So it is in seeing and constructing the Muslim today as uncivil and unable to therefore belong to modern European society, this allows for this distinction to take hold and to perpetuate across generations, across time. Now, I think in our discussion might talk more about some of the concepts in my book, but as exciting as it is to talk about sociological concepts, I won't do that to you. And instead, I will talk about kind of some of the rich stories that came out of my interactions with my interlocutors at the Sheikh Mosque. This is a photograph from the mosque. I actually really like talking to audiences here who know about the places that I'm talking about. And many of you, I'm sure, have visited some of these places. So I will start actually with some stories from the Jewish Museum. And the reason that I'm telling stories from the Jewish Museum is because a handful of my interlocutors from the Sheikh Mosque worked at the Jewish Museum. Now, these are young Muslims born in Berlin who often saw in themselves kind of echoes of this past. They describe their own empathy coming from the sense that they could feel, again, we're not talking about parallels to the Holocaust, but that they could feel kind of the exclusions and the sense of not full belonging that Jews had experienced in earlier times, specifically in the early 20th century. And because of that, they got really engaged, sometimes in sort of Jewish-Muslim alliances, but also in this historical work. It was, in fact, a Sheikh Mosque member who built up the kind of comparative Torah on Judaism and Islam at the Sheikh Mosque. It was also a Sheikh Mosque member who built up the Torah on new migration histories and why that relates to the Jewish history of Germany. And I think these are sometimes stories we don't hear. So all of the stories I'll tell you today come from my research, which was ethnographic mostly, but also interviews from 2013 to 2017 at the Sheikh Mosque. So in summer 2013, at the beginning of my research, I met this young Sheikh community member. He had just finished college, and he was thinking about starting his PhD while he worked as a tour guide at the Jewish Museum. And I remember we were sitting in the courtyard in what was termed, he told me, a sukkah made of glass and steel. And the museum was starting to face some of this conflict that will culminate at the end of this story, and that many of you probably have read about already. And the conflict, he said, was about how to represent the plurality of German society today, while also representing the particularity of the Jewish experience in Germany. Now, over the years, I met with Harun and others from the Sheikh Mosque. This is a photograph from the Jewish Museum exhibition on Jerusalem. From the period, and this actually went beyond my official kind of dissertation or research period for my book, from the period of about 2013 to 2019, there were many kind of conflicts emerged, but so did many new waves of work that brought Jewish and Muslim life into conversation. So these are some examples. There is this Jerusalem exhibition on Jerusalem, Welcome to Jerusalem, in 2018. This actually is becomes very controversial. But it began with this exhibition on circumcision. And the reason is because circumcision was outlawed for a period in 2012 by the Cologne Appellate Court. This followed a botched, basically, or not a botch, but a complication coming out of a circumcision on a young Muslim boy in Cologne, and a circumcision that had been undertaken by a Muslim doctor. And many individuals like Harun described to me that this would have never happened in their opinion. This outlawing would not have happened if it wasn't a Muslim body, because Muslim bodies are seen as so uncivil and outside of the kind of realm of what can be German. And it was not well reflected on that it would also affect the Jewish populace. And in fact, not more deeply, but with more time pressure, because in Judaism, you circumcise on the 8th day. And so for the Jewish community, this was high pressure to kind of get this overturned. So this circumcision exhibition occurred in the aftermath of the law being put in place to outlaw circumcision and then being overturned. Although certain kind of legal measures are now still in place, like you have to have a doctor present, can only be at a certain age, it can only be, sometimes you need anesthesia, so it's more regulated than it was before, but circumcision is no longer outlawed. This is just the short video so you can kind of see what's happening in the museum. Oh, I don't think I have sound, but that's okay too. You can see the images. And they're great. It's not just this, like the museum's sort of visual films and materials are generally quite interesting. So in this photograph, what you see is many years later, which is in 2018, when the museum puts on this exhibition called Welcome to Jerusalem, which portrays Jewish, Muslim, and Christian claims on the city. Now, there was huge backlash against this because it was said that the Kaaba was so much larger than anything else. The model of the Kaaba was so much larger than anything else that the Israeli government actually complained. The Central Council of Jews in Germany complained and said that this showed a privileging of Muslims in the Jewish museum. So later, just about a year later in 2019, there was an event held at the Jewish Museum's Academy, which is sort of like its intellectual hub or place for more academic or intellectual discussions, that brought Farid Hafez, who is a professor in Austria, but also a known BDS supporter. And this became kind of the moment that led to the president, Peter Schaefer, and the Academy director, Yasmin Schumann, stepping down, because there was so much conflict over who the Jewish Museum is for. And my interlocutors who worked there said that this questioning of who the Jewish Museum is for actually reflected a broader experience that they had in German public life. Who is Germany for, Harun asked me. Who is Berlin for? Is Berlin a place in which we can have not only not kind of equal footing as Germans, but also not equal footing as an Abrahamic minority in Europe? And so he kind of spoke towards this at once shared positionality in some ways, but also hierarchical positionality between Muslims and Jews in Germany. So again, he focused on the incivility of the circumcision ban, which was always the example he would come back to. He would talk about kind of what had happened in the Jewish Museum as one example, but this was sort of the ultimate example. Because on the one hand, it showed the incivility of both Jews and Muslims. So what he said to me was, what was very significant is that the practice was portrayed as a barbaric practice. And okay, now we teach you what to do. We Christian society, we German society, we've overcome certain barbaric traditions. We've modernized with the Enlightenment and everything. We've left things behind. We have overcome this. So no, you know it's time now for you guys to arrive here. And so there was this kind of shared position of being what this Abrahamic stranger, so non-Christian or non-culturally Christian group in Germany. And he talked about how some people came out and said they were happy because it showed actually how problematic both Muslims and Jews are. And this one example was a perfect example of why they both should be kind of excluded from German society. But on the same kind of, or the other side of the coin in this situation, he spoke about how there was this kind of difference between Muslims and Jews, and there was this hierarchy in the conversation. So again, when he spoke of how it had happened, the reason that circumcision could be outlawed for even a period is because it happened to a Muslim boy and was undertaken by a Muslim doctor. And the only reason this got overturned was because of the outrage about limiting Jewish life in Germany. And so Muslims were kind of left out of this more public conversation about the problematic repercussions of the law. But there's something else I think that's going on here that relates to civility, or this idea of incivility. And it was the true incomprehensibility of circumcision that came out in the discussion. So it was framed as torture, as, you know, basically violating individual and human rights, because children wouldn't have a choice. So you should, some of the arguments were that you should wait until a child is an adult and can decide for themselves. But this idea of kind of having, rather than coherence, but having a kind of cohesive community got overlooked. And this idea that pain, in the way that Western or European society often thinks about it as only negative, that accepting the presence of pain, although circumcision is not about pain primarily, it's accepted as part of the experience, it called forth this division between the obligation of rights to the individual and the obligation of piety in a religious tradition and a collectivity. So there is a way in which I think Richard Sennett's work speaks to this. Richard Sennett is a social theorist. He wrote a book, well, he wrote many books, but called Flesh and Stone, in which he talks about kind of the possibility of solidarity coming from the recognition of pain, both in the self and the other, and the acceptance of pain as well. And he talks about how in arousing sympathy for the other, well, it can only occur by understanding why bodily pain requires a place in which it can be acknowledged and in which its transcendent origins become visible. Such pain has a trajectory in human experience, he says. It disorients and makes incomplete the self, defeats the desire for coherence. The body accepting pain is ready to become a civic body, sensible to the pain of another person, pains present together on the street. So perhaps most important here for my own argument is this kind of sensibility to pain and acceptance of pain defeats this dominant desire for coherence and order that I think arises from a quite a dangerous myth that creates and casts anyone who is not seen to kind of fit into the order, like those I term strangers in society, as threats to the order of modernity. And so this suggestion from Sennett is that creating a civic body allows for solidarity, essentially, that displaces this drive for coherence. So in the end of our conversation, Harun turned towards this differentiation again, about this hierarchy between the experience of Muslims and Jews and their placement in German society. And he spoke about Thilo Sarrazin, who I'm sure most of you know who that is, so I don't have to explain in detail, but basically a former SPD politician who wrote extensively about why Muslims are problematic in society, whether in Deutschland schafft sich ab, or the newer book, which is really explicitly about Islam. Well, they're both somewhat, but the newer one even more so. And he spoke about how when he publicly started speaking about genetics, genes, and Jews, and this was right after this circumcision kind of debacle, he got critiqued. But when he talked about Arabs and Turks, he didn't get critiqued at all. So he kind of apologized and said, like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have talked about genetics and Jews together. But he never did the same thing for Muslims, for Turks and Arabs, who are kind of interchangeably named throughout his texts. So this is what Harun came to describe as the secondary placement of Muslims in Germany. And he also discussed certain things like synagogues having police protection, which is not unproblematic, of course, but mosques being surveilled by police, or the ways in which Jewishness and the Judeo is sometimes included when it's seen to be kind of part of us against Islam. For instance, with the new anti-Semitism. He was highly critical of this, as many of my interlocutors were. So Harun, for instance, studies anti-Semitism. He studies in his PhD, in fact, the experiences of kind of anti-Muslim sentiment rising and anti-Semitism rising in parallel, often among the same people. And so he spoke a lot about how there was this kind of red line against anti-Semitism in the public sphere, but not really. What really was happening was this new anti-Semitism became a way in which to cast Muslims as entirely uncivil, because if Muslims were to blame for the resurgence of anti-Semitism after everything that Germany has done to kind of purge itself of anti-Semitism, then they most certainly could not be part of a sort of civil sphere. He gave me all of these statistics. I remember he handed me statistics on who was kind of to blame for anti-Semitic violent attacks, all of these statistics to say basically like the overwhelming majority of these cases are coming from the far right wing, but the ones that we see in the media, the pictures, the images, they're young Arab boys. So why is this happening? And he said it was very much a way in which to kind of make Muslims aware that they were seen as uncivil, and also a way to break down the possibilities for cooperation between Muslim and Jewish communities in Berlin, for him, where he lived. He spoke a lot about how anti-Semitic sentiment persists in his community, specifically certain tropes. So it wasn't as if it didn't exist, but this kind of projection of Muslims or of anti-Semitism onto Muslims and the blame onto Muslims for this broader kind of societal ill, in fact, just revealed something that was wrong with Germany in his view. Well, perhaps in my view too, but I am talking about his reflections. In this, he once brought up the picture of Dorian Gray, and I thought it was a really wonderful metaphor. And it was also used by Richard Sennett in his work when he spoke about the Pegida marchers. And what Richard Sennett wrote about the Pegida marchers, which I think sort of captures this extremely well, is that images of the stranger define exactly how a people does not want to see itself, as in the portrait of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. So in some ways, this image of the Muslim as anti-Semitism's new face in post-war Europe is akin to that portrait in terms of having a false reflection under which an untenable face of an exclusive European, the quote, modernity resides. Now, before we turn towards our discussion, I'll actually leave Berlin and I'll take you to my beloved home neighborhood of Morningside Heights in New York City, where many of the Jewish thinkers whose thought I worked with ended up going into exile. Not all into this neighborhood, actually, but into New York. But there is a poem that was written in Morningside Heights by Hannah Arendt for Walter Benjamin after he died. He committed suicide. Well, it's difficult to really call it suicide. He thought that he would be caught by the Nazis, and then he killed himself in order to avoid being caught by the Nazis when he was fleeing through Portugal. So the poem that she wrote, these are a few lines of it, "Our dusk will come again sometime, night will come down from the stars, we will rest our outstretched arms in the nearness, the distances." When I read this poem, I thought about how it was this combination of nearness and distance that characterized the perspective of many 20th century Jewish thinkers who were themselves once strangers in the European metropolis, in Berlin, in London, other places. And we often think of this in terms of victimhood when we look back on the past, especially on the rise of National Socialism. But this also endowed this very unique perspective of Europe. In the words of Zygmunt Bauman, European Jews were, that's not Zygmunt Bauman, that's Toni Morrison, that's the last one. European Jews were always on the outside, even when inside, examining the familiar as if it was a foreign object of study, asking questions no one else asked, and questioning the unquestionable, challenging the unchallengeable. So it's this Jewish positionality that I think created a critical, if at times, and still to this day, I won't mention names, but uncomfortable perspective of European modernity, and one that's actually echoed in Islamic sources. So one scholar of Islamic thought, Ibrahim Musa, explains that the Prophet Muhammad himself posited that Islam began as a stranger and will be recovered by the stranger in exile or diaspora. He himself goes into this textual conversation with a formative Muslim scholar, Al-Ghazali. I think many of you have heard of him. But he writes too, similarly as Bauman, of this kind of unique knowledge that you get when you inhabit a literal or cultural threshold. He says that that experience allows one to see, to view things in a way that a domesticated or complacent gaze may fail to observe. So my interlocutors at the Shaitlik Mosque, like Harun, whose stories I drew from today, they reside, like it or not, in this societal threshold. It is often challenging and uncomfortable, but it also produces within them a critical capacity that allowed them to question taken for granted assumptions about Europe. And through them, that's how I came to question many taken for granted assumptions that I had. In fact, I was led back to 20th century Jewish scholarship by Shaitlik Mosque members themselves. It wasn't me kind of pulling them off my parents' shelves. It was them saying, you should really, really reread some of this. You should read Hannah Arendt. You should read Walter Benjamin. And even that, people would be shocked by when I would say it's not the kind of images that we have of Muslims in a mosque. It's not the images, that we have at all. So in Morningside Heights, another great thinker, Edward Said, once wrote of Muslims and Jews in Europe as unfortunate secret sharers, on whom, in the words of Wilfried Graff, the shadow of Western civilization is cast. Yet shadows are made not of darkness, but of light turned inside out. So in my book, I kind of push to shifting our perspective to the shadows of the Enlightenment. This is not saying that the Enlightenment is bad and shouldn't have happened, but kind of what hasn't been resolved. What are the failures? What are the things that need to be worked out? Who has been left behind in this process? And what I found was that this question of the Muslim question, which you often see in the news in various ways, which many will say echoes the Jewish question, both of them really point to the question of Europe. So what is Europe? Who does it include and exclude? How does it reckon with its own plurality? And so to make things more complicated, I would say you can leave Europe and think more broadly of Western society. It is something that the late and brilliant Toni Morrison has written about extensively when she writes about strangers. She asks, this is in her critical appraisal of the United States, but I think is very appropriate for critically appraising Europe. Why should we want to know a stranger when it is easier to estrange another? Why should we close the distance when we can close the gate? And then perhaps she answers her own question later in her essay on strangers, the same essay on strangers, where she says, there are no strangers. There are only versions of ourselves, many of which we have not embraced, most of which we wish to protect ourselves from. For the stranger is not foreign, she is random, not alien, but remembered. And it is the randomness, although unacknowledged selves, that summons a ripple of alarm. Perhaps this is also what is happening in Europe. So I'll stop there.
I would like to use or unuse my position there to engage with Elisabeth first before opening the round for a general discussion. But I thought, and having had the privilege of being able to read the book, so I might ask some questions. And one question which relates to the things you said in the end. I mean, in your book, you describe European society as a caste society. And you say you prefer the word caste as a description to anti-Muslim racism or something like that, or Islamophobia or whatever. So because it's sociologically more precise, and it points to a real deficit, which European society doesn't want to see, be aware of. That is the permanence of caste, the permanence of Jewish exclusion, and the permanence of Muslim exclusion, which is exactly a characteristic of caste society. It kind of goes beyond class, exclusion by class, because it's not that you might make your way economically or academically in a society, and still you are excluded because of your ethnic background, your religious background, your racial background, or whatever. And this is, in fact, not only, as we said in the end, referred a European experience, but it's also the Western experience. And of course, naming or describing Western societies as caste societies really goes against the book. I mean, caste societies exist in some parts of Africa, but not here. We are an enlightened society, and we are proud to have had enlightenment. We are in the tradition of enlightenment. Enlightenment means rejection of caste, means reflection of privilege by birth, and means rejection of notions of discrimination based skin color, religion, or gender. So, but when you point it out, there's a serious question. It is a question about, are we caught in caste societies? Is there a way out of caste society? And in some parts of your book, you sound very melancholic. It seems, no. Basically, this is a thing we have to live with. In other parts of your book, you are more optimistic. And then you refer to the kind of, yes, you refer to the experience of cities. You refer to the experience of immigration societies. But I didn't quite figure out what you...
Me neither. Yeah, so that's I didn't go into the whole caste argument, which I will in 1 minute somehow painfully make, but it is uncomfortable. It's not meant to be provocative, but it provokes very strong reactions because of what we associate with caste. But I also think that some of the kind of power of the term is trying to look beyond that. Caste was used as a term in sociology to signal a status-based difference based essentially on impurity or pollution, and a status that it's really hard to move out of, even if economically you're thriving, so you can move up in class while still not moving up in caste. And I specifically used Herbert Ganz's work on undercaste. Now he always drops it in as this kind of sudden, he talks about undercaste and he just moves on. But he would talk about how it's getting caught in this basically seen to be culturally inferior position in society. And I thought it was the best concept that we have to describe this position. I am not someone who thinks that this is a race only situation. And I'm also not someone who thinks it's a religion only situation. And so it sort of helps to encapsulate this shifting signifier, because it can be because of your religion or your race or your ethnicity or your culture, or it can be all of those things at once that make you into somehow an outsider. Well, not exactly an outsider, but hierarchy, seen as in this kind of cultural hierarchy as not as high as. And caste captured that for me. And then when I looked into the origins of caste, it doesn't come from India, which everyone would like to believe in Western society, but it in fact comes from Europe, or what became Europe, and the process of purging Jews and Muslims from Europe during the Reconquista. And I don't think there is this linearity where it's like things have continued from there, but I think there are these echoes. I think there are these means of exclusion that have shifted through religion to kind of biological notions and back again, and to this grand or this vague idea of culture that can be better captured by caste than race, which in my discipline is the dominant framework. because I think something more complicated is happening, and I think it's something more structural. And I think it's not just about race, although I do think racialization occurs. I think I swing between both depending on what's happening in terms of like, is there a way out of this? I think the way out of it is unfortunately requires not only a humbling, but a sort of way of incorporating alternative perspective that I don't think will happen, because I think the fear is too high. I think it's the way in which we think about European society, or let's say German society. I don't think that there is a way in which Muslims can be equal fully, not in the Europe that I see today or Germany I see today, because then you would have to take their traditions, their histories, kind of on equal footing, their culture on equal footing. And I don't really see that happening, except sometimes in cities. I think there are these pockets in cities, and especially in Berlin or London, where you do see kind of on a more localized level, this more truly democratic process that includes different perspectives, different languages, different like grammars. It's not all about being able to speak the kind of secular language, but what about if we all could actually understand something about Islam, or we were able to speak the language of the religion, but also the culture, is like Turkish culture, which is a huge cultural component of Germany. And I do see that in cities. I do see that in parts of Berlin, but on like a national level, I don't know. I think there's still so much persecution, and there's still so much ingrained even in the law. Like if you look at the new headscarf law on legal trainees, it's just such targeted inequality or targeted marginalization that I'm not that hopeful, but I'm not an optimist in general.
Well, one way I thought about it when you just came, when you presented your talk, is the shadows of enlightenment. And this reminds me of another great Jewish thinker whom you don't mention, Adorno's concept of the dialectics of enlightenment. And in fact, this might be a way, points to a direction where we might be thinking, if we are away or we get more aware of the idea that enlightenment is not just an achievement we have and we can be proud of, but that there's a dark side, the shadows of enlightenment, which is racism, colonialism, oppression, armies worldwide, and exploitation. If we have that always in mind, we can keep the idea of enlightenment while at the same time being not enlightenment fundamentalists. And being enlightenment fundamentalists would mean that we are simply proud as being enlightened and declare others as not being uncivilized and excluded. And we might be, by again reflecting more thoroughly on the work, on that big major work of Adorno and Horkheimer, get a way of approaching other traditions. Because I mean, what you really point out, and which seems crucial, is that the Muslims currently, and the Jews a little less so, but this is another topic, is portrayed not as other to Europe, but as uncivilized, that the boundary is not between us and them, but between us, the enlightened and civilized, and them, the uncivilized, having not lived through enlightenment, and therefore are now partners for discussion or things.
Yeah. And I think that's a really crucial part, because you keep hearing, not just here, but you keep hearing this discussion of like, well, Muslims need to go through an enlightenment. Jews went through an enlightenment. Europe went through an enlightenment, which I find is just a very strange thing to say to European Muslims who live in Europe and were born in Europe. It's just, I think it brings up that kind of way in which there are divisions. But I'm not a sort of anti, and I'm not at all. It's more about kind of how are you critical and how are you able to see what is not, those shadows, and not just accept them and say it's fine. And yeah, I don't have an alternative to the Enlightenment.
There's another point which might be criticized, not by me, because I think that's something we have to take notice of. This is a place of religion, the process of discussion.
There is.
And you are very open to the religious experiences, which makes a big difference to the German mainstream discourse.
That's true.
I mean, and it takes up the American discourse, it takes up New York, the experience of New York, in which the religious self-organization is seen as a way of opting into society, of getting a base, creating a basis from which to move on into society, and giving a way where you can build your existence and gain a sense of value for yourselves in a hostile environment. And all migration societies are in a way hostile. All immigration process has to encounter hostility. And there, the American experience, which you make strong, is a kind of a positive way of seeing self-organization. And this strictly contrasts with the German mainstream view. In Germany, religion and religious organization, self-organization is seen as a way opting out. You opt out, you build parallel societies, as it said, you say no to light culture, you say, you reject German society and in a way in favoring an Islamic counter society. This is how religion is portrayed, and you give strong examples, at least in the Schädlich Mosque, where you question this experience.
Yeah, so this I do think is a contrast, and I think creates this boundary to religious communities and experience that in the US case, for instance, you would not have. Where I think in the US case, the sort of dividing line remains race. It doesn't mean Muslims don't experience discrimination, or Jews or others, but I think there is this kind of racial paradigm historically, and in Europe, it's historically been religion. And I think the religious aspect is not something you can leave out either when you're thinking about how people or communities are included or not included, and how they contend with that, which in the Schädlich Mosque, some of it was through this secularizing language and making kind of legible through the secular language what people were doing and why kind of we have the same values of equality and freedom, and we value human rights and the environment. And it was very much kind of engaging with the secular discourse of German society. I can stop there. So.
Yeah, and then that opens a question, because I mean, you unfortunately didn't mention it in your talk, but you did field research in London.
I did, yeah.
And here you have
a very
completely different type of mosque. Now, the Schädlich Mosque, it is not at all mosques are like the Schädlich Mosque, which has a kind of an ethics of responsibility, which you, with Hans Jonas, departing from Hans Jonas, kind of describe as their ethics and an outreach and trying to network across communities. In East London, you have a different experience. You have a messianic mosque. And here, this is in fact a much more challenging case of religion in the city, because messianism is easily explained, and sometimes I get to when reading your experience. I mean, these are, one has to be clear about what is meant with messianism. Messianism means to calculate on the end of times, to take serious the end of history, to take serious that there is another world, that there's transcendence. It means to pose the Kierkegaard question of either or. Either you are religious, or you are, and then you count on afterlife and on responsibility before God, or you are secular, and then you can play religion, Kierkegaard says, but you are not serious about religion. And here, and this is a really personal question about a different type of religion, which is much more purity oriented, which is much less on responsibility, ethics, and going on, but it is on kind of really saving your souls from current society and world. And personally, I always feel when I got in my research across Messianists, the limits of anthropology. And this is a very personal question. How did you deal with it? Because it is very difficult, really, to get a sociological grip of an understanding of people who have messianic outlooks.
If you don't have a messianic outlook.
If you don't have a messianic outlook yourself,
The East London Mosque is this very interesting mosque in East London, which is historically not very well off. It was very poor. It's still quite poor, and it was mostly Bengali, but also Pakistani historically, and it draws from its different strands, but is predominantly messianic and sort of puritanical, I would say, draws from what are sometimes seen as contrasting traditions, Wahhabism, Salafism, Sufism. I once wrote a paper and I submitted it and it got sent back and they were like, impossible. It's just not true. But I was just taking the scholars that they were using and like the books and the teachings that they were saying, and I was seeing that they were from these different sources. But it was much more of a struggle to be at Shade. We have a lot in common, frankly. I had a lot in common with many of the community members. At the East London Mosque, no, not necessarily, but I mean, we did have certain things in common, but we had very different perspectives. It was much less lasting relationships. It was very intense in the beginning because it was also kind of somewhat proselytizing, kind of encouraging you, and it was a very sort of intensive, immersive experience, and then an intensive rejection. Once there's a realization that you won't enter into this. But for me, it also was a suspension of my own, not my own belief, but me trying really hard to say, what if I just tried to understand how they see their world and their lives? And it's not even, I'm not projecting how I see things. And there were moments that it happened. And in those moments, I became much more critical of the things that I kind of take for granted as what is normal, what is good in society. There were certain things I always thought, and that community challenged me on so many levels. The security situation there was really intense because of the type of community it is, and it got much worse while I was there. And that experience also made me understand somewhat the attraction of Messianism in those circumstances, in those kind of
approaching with Walter Benjamin
and
his takes on history.
And I read
philosophy of history.
So I tried to get at it from very angles, but I think you're right. I think we all go into, if you research people or with people, you go into it with your own, who you are. And it is that combination of who you are and what you know and what you think, and those communities and those individuals that create something. I don't think you get a sort of objective view from the outside, well, the inside outside, sort of, you can know everything. I didn't have that experience, but some of the most kind of satisfying periods of my research were at the East London Mosque, because I had to invest so much into saying, like, what if I did participate in this world? What if I really try to understand where these experiences and these yearnings are coming from? You know, and I'm someone who hates rules. So it was like the opposite experience, but being able to see that and find empathy and find shared ground was also very satisfying. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I wanted just to open the discussion, and by pointing out to several points, and now I would like to give it to the audience.
So thank you both very much. I have a comment and a bit of a question for Werner Schiffauer, and a bunch of questions for Elisabeth Becker, but I'll confine myself, I think, to one. I want to make a very, very brief plea for Enlightenment fundamentalism, not because I think it means the belief that we're enlightened and the rest of them should get to it, but because a lot of my work has been in the history of philosophy, focusing on the 18th century. And I know that the Enlightenment were the first people to invent the concept of Eurocentrism. Just think about Montesquieu's The Persians criticizing Europe from the perspective of Muslims. And there was a whole trope of people writing in the voice of indigenous peoples, of the Chinese, to say things, asserting the superiority of other cultures to European in various ways. So I'm always a bit puzzled when serious people, have taken up this narrative about the Enlightenment, which was the first movement that ever seriously criticized colonialism. I'm just puzzled by it, and I forgive me, I won't go into a rant, but I can't let this stand at the Einstein Forum. And I'm also a bit puzzled about because maybe I've read and taught Dialectic of Enlightenment many times. I don't remember any critique of colonialism or racism in that. They have other critiques of the Enlightenment. Yeah, okay, all right, fine, okay. And for Elisabeth, all kinds of very interesting questions. I mean, one, I would love to hear more about your understanding of caste and what you think of Isabel Wilkerson's discussion of caste, and maybe just a little tiny question about the Jewish Museum. I thought the argument about the Welcome to Jerusalem exhibit was not about the size of the Kaaba, but the fact that they showed the massacre of Deir Yassin.
Also,
Well, both of those.
I think that was stood true, but it didn't come out from the people that I spoke to, but it was actually in the critique. So I think that's correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. Do you want to say?
Can I say one thing about I don't know if this is what you meant, but I think what I tried in my book to say, and maybe this is what you were getting into, but maybe not, in terms of enlightenment, but not just in enlightenment, was like actually how these words become emptied. People don't know what they're talking about. So when they say like, we're enlightened and you're not enlightened, well, they're kind of going against many of the ideas of the enlightened, or, we're all for freedom, which is why you can't wear a headscarf. It's like these ways in which I think the terms become emptied of their meaning. And it was something that when I was reading a lot of the discourse, and that would make me crazy, because it was like, we're all for equality, which is why, women in France, can't wear, or girls in France can't wear headscarves to school. So it was like, I think a lot of the Enlightenment language now became like a mainstream language that actually belittles many of the kind of values that we're supposed to have or supposed to share. But, you can't really value enlightenment thinking or freedom or equality or many other things, and then not question like the structures in our society. So I don't know if that's what you're pointing to, but it was something, because when I would sometimes use enlightenment in quotes in my book, and that's sort of what I meant, this idea, but it was like a floating word, but no one knew what they were referring to. And it gets abused, so we drop it and we say like, so I don't know if that was it. Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste came, I think, like out 2 weeks or 3 weeks before I had to hand in my final, like, the pages. So I had to put in like one footnote being, I have to properly read the book. But I actually agreed with so much. Like, I see so many parallels, not in the histories, very different histories, very different experiences, but I see a lot of parallels in the kind of function of having Black Americans as this violent, dangerous, imprisoned, kind of on a lot of the same markers you see based on race that I see with Muslims in the European context, and even the language used, like to describe men, to describe the oppression of women, or the weakness of women. And so when she came out with this book on caste, I found it quite convincing. Not because, again, she's trying to say that race doesn't matter. What she's talking about, a racial caste system, which is not what I was doing. But the way in which she talks about this kind of structure we don't see because it's so ingrained in us, it's so normalized to us. So we can see race, we're taught to see race, but we can't kind of see the whole social structure behind it that upholds it and that normalizes it to us. Like the fact that it's normal for someone to say to a Muslim, why is there a suicide bomber in this place, like some random place, or why can't women in Saudi Arabia drive? This kind of but I don't think most people would question those questions. Maybe you in the room would question those, but like the majority of society, those questions being posed. And I think the same thing happens with Black Americans being kind of in this similar type of inside-outside positionality, really fundamental to the creation of the United States, and yet perpetually put into this kind of lower cultural status, which feeds into economics and from economics, especially in the US. But yeah, so caste, I think, functions to me in a lot of the same ways in how I thought about it, in terms of being this status, being this status that's very hard to get out of, not impossible to get out of, just like it's not impossible to get out of a caste status in India. I'm not making a parallel, but I wrote a paper on caste where I actually looked at indicators. It's not what I do, but I looked at indicators to say, if we're going to talk about, in India, there are these problems because of intermarriage rates are so low. Well, there are similar intermarriage rates in Europe between Muslims and non-Muslims. We're going to talk about caste because of residential segregation. Well, they're actually really similar patterns of segregation. It was like everything kind of mapped out quite similarly. My point was never to make a parallel with India, but since that was always the case of people critiquing, like, you cannot use caste, we are not that bad, basically. If you look at those kind of like, if you look at educational, if you look at employment, it all is very similar kind of percentages and very similar types of or ways in which people are constrained in society. And I think that's what Wilkerson points to in a very brilliant way. Whether you believe it's caste or not, whatever you want to call it, there is this kind of unmovingness. You can shift it. And certain people, of course, these are especially model minorities, which is the worst kind of framework to have. And the Sheikh Mosque was, for a long time, a model mosque. That's what the police officers I interviewed called it. Until they decided it was linked to Erdogan and there were spies, and now it's no longer a model mosque. But I think you have this similar kind of framework of othering, and I think there is a sort of rigidity that we don't want to admit. Like, we want to think anybody, if they work hard enough, can get out of this, or anybody, if they're just good enough and they integrate enough and they have our values. And I think, just as in the US case, I think it's not true. If you look statistically, which is, again, not my area, but that was the way in which I pushed back against that. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's not actually my question. It's from the Zoom talk from the audience. Okay. And it's posed by Misha Gabovich, a trusted colleague of ours, who wanted to be here but had to quarantine because of family members being affected by corona. I'll read out the question. It's very long. It's Misha. You talked about your interlocutors' engagement with European Jewish thought about the Enlightenment and the position of the stranger. Are any of them interested in the history of communitarian models of societal organization, such as those that existed in the Ottoman, Russian, and Habsburg empires? Or the kind of US model that Werner Schiffauer referred to, a kind of society where people would be formally defined through their membership in religious or other communities, perhaps even one where communities would have some internal autonomy in managing their own affairs, and different rules would apply to different groups. I'm not asking whether they positively advocate these kinds of models for the present, rather about whether such communitarianisms are even on the horizon of historical and political imagination.
That's a really interesting question. I would say yes and no. I mean, there was a sometimes romanticization, I think, of the Ottoman Empire and also of Andalusia, but not because it was communitarian, but usually they were talking about the sort of multicultural capacities or living together of groups and examples from the past. And under the Ottomans, there was actually a discussion of how people were given autonomy and how religious groups and ethnic groups were given autonomy over their own communities. And their argument was that it was, or I did have some of my interlocutors who thought that this was a much better model than what we see in Europe today. But in terms, in the UK, there was sort of a functioning as a separate community, actually, quite a bit. The UK, there is more room for that. I mean, the kind of older multicultural model did create more room for having greater autonomy. But the problem that happened when I was there is it was a community with quite a bit of autonomy. It was the time that the Sharia courts were put in place, which are not an alternative to British law, but were a place in which certain conflicts and specifically Islamic divorces were being carried out. But there was a time in which there was a security crackdown, like in the middle of my research, I think around 2014, 2015. So between my two research periods in London, the first time I was there, it was a very kind of autonomous community that thought it had created this space in East London. And then the second time I went, it felt almost like it had been devastated. They had these raids on a lot of the madrasas in the neighborhood because one had like kids, I don't know, there too long or not sleeping in art. I don't know exactly the situation, that those were the claims, but then they raided all the madrasas, and there was this like very strong police presence in the mosques, and there was this Trojan horse affair, which I won't go into detail, but these kind of like strange theories about infiltration in the school systems by Islamic extremists. And so the shift in the kind of national culture, which we see shifted more to the right progressively, really affected the community because it had quite a bit of autonomy. Here in Germany, it was more a sort of, I did see the romanticization of the Ottoman Empire's capacity to give people autonomy, or communities autonomy. And in the US, one of my, I don't want to say favorite, because you're not supposed to have favorite interlocutors, but this young man, Yusuf, he studied in the US. He studied in Alabama, no, Texas, but then he traveled to Alabama, and he was telling me how he met this guy. He's like, he's an African-American Muslim. That's how he described him. And he said to him, you know, where are you from? And the guy was like, well, I'm from Kentucky. And he's like, no, like, where are you originally from? He's like, oh yeah, originally Mississippi. Then he was like, no, I mean, like, where are your parents from? And he's like, I don't understand what you're trying to ask me. And he told me this was a moment in which being Muslim wasn't about being a foreigner or from somewhere else. And it was a kind of moment in which he saw a different type of possibility for religion.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
If that's okay. I'm wondering a bit about the chronology. When you talk to your interlocutors in Neukölln, that must have been about 2 years after the infamous sentence of our hapless ex-president Christian Wulff, who said that Islam gehört zu Deutschland, which, as a statement of fact, is of course a nonsense sentence, but as a moral imperative, it is not. And I wonder how your interlocutors reacted to this, if at all, if they made at all any reference to it. And well, you may answer. I have another question, if I may, in a minute.
There was a lot of discussion about, there would sometimes actually reference specific instances like that. And but often there was just a lot of discussion of like, the fact is, I'm not really German. I mean, this is just not a question. A lot of my interlocutors, which is why I came to focus so much on the city. So they would be very much identifying with Berlin, with the neighborhood, and but not with Turkey or with Germany. And they would say, this is because I'm told constantly I'm not German. It's not for any complicated reason. And it comes from all these different levels. And whether Islam can be part of Germany, I think there was a hope that it could be, especially in this community that was doing a lot of work to kind of show how it is and can be. But there also was this notion that it hadn't kind of like arrived in the same status. And they were very good at deconstructing the kind of reasons behind this, or the language in which it's cast, like Muslims can't be represented, right? There's no hierarchy in Islam. We can't have Muslim representatives. We can't fit into the church model that Germany has. I mean, it would be a little, it's hard to say that Judaism could fit that, and they managed to pull together a group of people. I think some of the language that they were criticizing came out. So yeah, I think more indirectly there was often a grappling with this, but sometimes directly. And you're looking at a community which again goes against a lot of stereotypes. I mean, I remember when people were like, are they very poor? In the US journals, because it's the US, a lot of class discussion in sociology. But I mean, these are extremely educated, extremely Germans who are extremely kind of taught critical thinking, have learned critical thinking, are very successful, some of them in their careers in various fields. It's not that they can't figure out what's going on or they don't know. Yeah, and not that they're kind of trapped just in economic precarity. There's something else happening. And so I think those discussions came up. I think when media would say, like when you would see these kind of grand political statements in the media, there would always be a reaction in the community. But this, I'm again talking about this kind of born Germans, not the migrant generation, which is a very different story. It's in my book as well, but it's not the focus. Yeah.
All right, now it really sounds like I'm monopolizing, but again, it's a question from the chat. It's not me. And it's Richard Rottenburg. He asked both the host and the panelist. Elisabeth, you found some interlocutors whom you let speak in the name of Muslim communities while being critical of the German situation and self-reflexive about their own position. But you did not seem to have found interlocutors for German communities with similar self-critical capacities. So in the end, you seem to end up as the only one who looks through things. That seems a bit like an Enlightenment campaign. Have you not learned anything that challenges your own pre-assumptions with which you started the investigation?
I mean, everything challenged my own pre-assumptions because I was brought up in these societies. I wasn't brought up in the kind of Muslim community. I think a lot of my expectations were colored by not extreme stereotypes, but other assumptions. I think in terms of Germans who are self-critical, there are many, of course, as there are in every society, but I wasn't really interested in I don't know, sort of dialogue work or community work. I was interested in how people, frankly, under constraints of power, exert agency on their circumstances and are able to not only kind of sort out critically what's happening in their lives, but influence their local, their kind of, or their lived experiences, which I think was the more optimistic part of my book. Because there is this capacity. Yeah, my response.
Well, and the book was not on intercultural relationships, but it was a book on reading the Muslim experience through the lens of Jewish thinkers and putting the idea of the marginality, of the stranger, of being inside, outside, at the same time being at the Schwelle, at the threshold of society in the center, and seeing how one can make sense or approach the Muslim experience in a different and new way through the lens of these thinkers. So it was not on a kind of symmetric thing, intercultural negotiations or something like that, but rather on how what we can learn and what we can grasp and see new through the light of this experience, and by that also to show that there's, although the experiences are different, and it is not that Elisabeth is saying it's exactly the same experience what the Muslims live through. Now it's kind of the concepts we use and we develop in order to grasp our situation, that we can put the these great thinkers in a dialogue with the Muslim actors today and see where they discover common grounds and refer to similar experiences. So this is what the book is about, and which makes it a fascinating lecture. I don't know what it is.
And it's very, those thinkers are, many of them, Enlightenment. I mean, they're in the tradition of the Enlightenment, if that's I don't know what the critique was about the Enlightenment. I'm not an anti kind of Enlightenment thinker at all.
Enlightenment bashing, Clint.
Yeah, so I don't think that that's a.
I think that
No, not from you,
There's-
from the questioner.
this is no, it is not an enlightenment.
No,
bashing,
not
and
from
it
you.
was not my.
No, I'm sorry, not from you, the person who asked the question.
Yeah, okay. No, but this refers to the other question. I think we have to live with modernity. I think there's no alternative to enlightenment. There's still a way to know where our thinking in enlightenment terms leads to a kind of certain tendency to oversee certain things, to privilege certain positions and to devalue other positions, and that we have to be very aware of these dangers. So you can say, okay, we are stuck with enlightenment. We cannot talk about irrationality. We cannot kind of favor irrationality, but we have to see the rationality of other positions, and this would be in the Enlightenment spirit. Usually it is used in the mainstream, and Elisabeth said it already, so I don't have to repeat it. The term enlightenment is used as a kind of positioning yourselves and kind of using it as a means. And when you say to another religion, go get through enlightenment, it's kind of all that gets a grain of enlightenment. The last question? Because we just rounded it up.
Now it's the me again, not the net. My own question, or at least perhaps more of a comment to start with. I'm very convinced by how you employed the concept of the incivility as a Zuschreibung. It's, I think, almost exactly 10 years ago that two men called Uwe blew themselves up in a mobile home, the infamous murderers of the NSU. And I think that is perhaps one of the best illustrations of what you told us about incivility, or the Zuschreibung of incivility, because no one even contemplated anything else but the Dönermorde, or a feud amongst Muslims, amongst foreigners. And that being a historic 10 years ago, I was wondering about how your interlocutors considered other historical shadows, not echoes, but shadows. You yourself mentioned the Reconquista as one of the starting points of your, I mean, that's a very long shadow, isn't it? We could take Vienna, that's a little bit, a few hundred years less, but we can also take more recent shadows of history that might inform this persistent Zuschreibung of incivility. For example, the first Anwerbeabkommen for Gastarbeiter. I mean, only the term Gastarbeiter is something that is luckily disappearing from our discourse, but they're events in history that still inform this Zuschreibung of incivility. And I wonder how you balance the long term and the short term in this regard. Sorry, it's been a long question.
Great. There was so two kind of separate responses. One was part of the reason I thought about the Reconquista is because in my first plan, I was going to go to Spain. I was going to have 3 cases, and one was going to be Madrid. And in Madrid, I went, which and it was fabulous in the beginning, but that didn't work out because of the timing. Charlie Hebdo happened like a week after I got there. I started hanging out in mosques. I set off security alarms everywhere. And then I was like, this is a bad time for everyone. I mean, the people in the mosques don't want to talk to you because one of the people involved in the attack had gone through the main mosque in Madrid. So there was all these things happening. There were ISIS, like money going through there at the time. And but I remember someone on the street when I just asked for directions to a mosque and they were like, oh, there are no mosques around here. I mean, there was the like central mosque, it was a few blocks away. And they said, you know, you should go to Cordoba. And then I was like, no, there's a mosque in the neighborhood. And they were like, oh, people don't like having kind of mosques here. Like, okay, why? And they said, we don't want a reconquista. And I was like, just the language of it, it seemed so kind of crazy, but it was so present. It's so present in the society when it reflects on its own history, not only in negative ways, actually there's like also this kind of romantic movement towards Andalusia. But in terms of my interlocutors, there was a lot of speaking about the guest worker experience and the kind of humiliation, especially among the first generation, but also their children. So their children would tell stories. There was one older man who had talked about how he actually got frostbite because he had a disagreement with his boss, but he was so dependent on his boss that he had to do what he said, essentially, which was stand outside of this warehouse. And then he got frostbite on his feet because it was negative. I mean, it was freezing and he wasn't wearing proper shoes. And this story in which he said, it used to be because I was a guest worker. And then it became because I was Turkish. And then it became because I was Muslim. So it must just be who I am. When I asked kind of what had happened to him. And I think this, again, this shift, I think it is this notion of incivility that can be because you're a migrant, and then it can be because you're an immigrant who's gonna stay, and then it can be because you're an ethnic or a racialized other, and it can be because of your religion of Islam. And it sometimes kind of shifts back, which makes it very hard to like capture. But I think there are moments, I mean, people did talk about those murders, they talked about a lot about the migration history and the sense that their parents had like not been able to live with dignity for periods of their lives. And that was something a lot of, I think, the second generation of the people who I spoke to, again, this is a community. This is not like all Muslims in Berlin or Europe. But that seemed to be a kind of sticking point, that coming as quote unquote guest workers and other language like Bio-Deutsch, which when I heard that, I was like, wait, you mean like biologically? And they were like, no, like organic Germans. So these, or the leading culture debates, the light culture, that was a big kind of sticking point. Especially again, when you're talking about these like philosophers who are German philosophers or philosophy students who are being told that they're not part of society. I mean, it shouldn't happen to anyone, but it's like when they would reflect on that in this very, finding it very difficult. But I think there is this kind of whole history where these kind of key historical markers or metaphors are drawn on, like the Reconquista period. But there are also these things that are closer to people and also closer in terms of their own family histories. Yeah.
Okay. I see no further questions. And we reached the end of the session, which we thought about. So I thank all of you for your participation and your interest. And I thank particularly Elisabeth for her presentation.
Thank you.
And we are quite curious to listen about your future project in some years when you are.
Yeah. Which starts now.
Not now.
I've just been reading books. I have this complete book budget. I've never had a book budget, so I've gotten out of control.